So I'm going to make this video quick, but I wanted to be able to outline 4 principles that I've grown into learning as an entrepreneur. This is really important. I'm now talking Facebook, LinkedIn, X, but Instagram here. This is really important as I've been an entrepreneur since I was a kid. I ran landscaping companies. I've worked on farms, delivered newspapers, refereed hockey, worked for herb transporting, washing, gassing up vehicles, transport trucks, tree planted, like endless of those type of jobs. Then I owned larger landscaping businesses in my 20s and then became a consultant. And I've owned multiple businesses in professional services since I was 30 years old. And over the years, you make a million mistakes. And as you make the mistakes, you start to realize what doesn't work. Actually, it's more owning a business is more deductive. So you fail probably 95% of the time. So you'll fail and then you'll take those mistakes and you'll kind of scratch them off the list. Well, hopefully you never do that again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. So here are the 4 principles that after growing businesses, I've had some what I'll call first base hits, sales for life. Did 18 or $20 million, extracted a couple $1 million in retained earnings and dividends and salaries out of it. Pipeline Signals, a bit of a bunt. The industry's gone kind of wonky for tech-enabled services and sales. And now offshoring with Get Leverage, which has really flourished, really taken off. There's a massive demand for offshore talent. So here's what I've learned. Number 1 core principle, recurring revenue business trumps reoccurring or fixed fee project-based revenue by a 10x multiple. And it's not just the obvious compounding effect. As Warren Buffett would always say, compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. Maybe he didn't invent that quote. Recurring revenue businesses are very similar. They can be very difficult to stand up initially because I'll give you an example. We'll Get Leverage. The average contract value is between $1,000 and $2,000 a month per customer. So you take a lot of units to start stacking on top of each other. But if you have a sticky enough product, if you have something that customers keep for long enough periods of time, it starts to stack on itself like a growing bank account. And it starts to hockey stick. And I've owned in Sales for Life a reoccurring business. So in Sales for Life, you do millions of dollars a year, and 50% of that revenue would roll over into the next year. About 50% of customers would do a project the next year, and 50% of customers would not. The challenge with that is you're replacing 50% of the business every year. Now, from 0 to $3 million, that is kind of tenable. But then you get into the compounding, the law of big numbers, into the 5 millions and beyond. Trying to replace $2.5 million every year becomes extremely difficult. Like that is so much net new business that's where a lot of companies that are reoccurring or even worse, project-based revenue, where you're replacing itself after every project, you just cannot keep up with that type of horsepower. So I would say first principle number 1 is a recurring revenue business. Difficult to stand up unless you have larger enterprise level deals. But again, recurring revenue and enterprise deals, it's going to take a long time for your sales cycle and win rates to be able to meet the growth of the company either way. So it's like a horse trade. You do smaller deals, you win lots of them, but the bank account grows slowly because of the reality of the size of the deal versus enterprise deals. The bank account can grow quickly because of the size of the deal, but your sales cycle velocity, the time it takes to win it, and the convertibility of that, you're not winning 50% of your deals, you're winning 18 to 25% of your deals. It kind of grows at that same pace. So that's first principle number 1. First principle number 2, credit card payments of something called days sales outstanding 0. Let me tell you a story. Sales for Life had what's called days sales outstanding about 60, meaning you do a deal with a customer and that customer puts in their contract that they'll pay you in net 60. Sounds good. But what that actually means is that you are their bank for 60 days. You are truly funding their business. You do work, you get paid in 60 days. Your bigger challenge is you haven't factored in that you go through all your operational expenses for 30 days, no money. You do it again for 30 days, no money. You're now really far in debt. So now the customer pays you on day 61, and you're literally using that money to pay off previous debts that you're accumulating. So you require a lot of working capital. It requires you having giant bank loans. This becomes a problem. The bigger you get, the bigger your deals get, the bigger your day sales outstanding. So at Sales for Life, we employed a teammate. It was one of my very first offshoring resources where I employed a teammate to do accounts receivables collection. And we built a whole process where they would send POs, and those POs were followed up on like a sales cycle, and they would have multiple touch points, and they would track down POs and remittance statements. And we got day sales outstanding to 30 days. And here's the magic of day 30 or 31. That means that you're getting your customer to ideally pay you before the last day of the month when your payroll, the biggest cost in a business, human capital, is due. And if you can make the money of the customer that you served in that month come before that 31st day, then you're in good standing. But if you miss it by a day and you get paid on the 32nd or 35th or 37th day, you are now funding an entire month for free on behalf of a customer to get paid. So the reason I'm saying day sales outstanding, 0. We launched Get Leverage, and I went through a massive problem at Pipeline Signals. We allowed customers to choose credit card payments and invoicing. 50% of customers chose credit cards, 50% invoicing. Of the invoicing customers, 100% of them had a problem paying on time. Day sales outstanding crept past day 30, and now I'm using human capital and my money to fund a global enterprise company. And that becomes a huge problem. So when I started Get Leverage, I made it a first principle. 0 customer, no matter how big, how sexy a logo, I did not care. They have to pay on credit card. Then they get their service. So I collect money on the 1st of the month. And all of a sudden, on the 30th of the month, my expenses are due, but I'm actually using my customer's money to pay my payroll. And so you can start a company with very little money down, and you're using your customer's capital to actually grow the business. It's called a positive cash flow cycle. So huge, huge win. Being able to stand up an entire company now with 30 employees off of the backs of customers' flywheel of credit card payments. Yes, you can argue, well, you pay a 4% on revenue fee, but you get a choice. Do you want to pay a interest payment on debt that you're accumulating? And now let's talk about the qualitative. You'll never be able to sleep because your bank loans will get bigger and bigger. Or do you want to lose 4% of the deal on credit card? Or you can raise your prices by 4% and offset that. So core principle number 3, especially for services business. If you own a SaaS company, this should be obvious to you. But if you own a services business, 80% gross margins are better. Every product, every customer, 80% gross margins. You ask how is that possible? Well, one of the advantages of using offshore talent is you can use that labor arbitrage to be able to reverse engineer your operating expenses, which are very low using offshore talent, multiply it by 5, and that's what your price should be. And so that's an 80% gross margin or better. Why 80% gross margin? That means that you have $8 of $10 that you collect to do and invest in sales and marketing and your administrative costs, office space, these sort of things, insurance, and you still create profit, and you create a healthy amount of profit that you have optionality. You have optionality to reinvest it back in the business. You have optionality to pay yourself. You have optionality to invest in other vehicles in other businesses. So a huge, huge win. 80% gross margins. It's the only way that it's a win for the customer and a win for yourself. Meaning, if you remain a competitive business doing great work, you can reinvest to doing more and more sales and marketing, live conferences, videos, webinars, podcasts. You can allow your brand to scale because you have much more capital to invest in sales and marketing. The final fourth principle, zero-based budgeting. Zero-based budgeting. Didn't even know what that was until I went through a financial crash in 2018 in my first company, Sales for Life. And then my mentor taught me about zero-based budgeting. And essentially, every 90 days, you take your P&L statement and you zero out every ledger item. And now you argue in, not punt over any expense. Every person on the team is argued, do I need that person? It's a yes, no statement. If yes, do they need to work fractionally or full-time? If so, do we reevaluate where that person lives or their operating cost? Same goes with every software. The reason this is so critical, I caught myself paying insurances for offices I didn't have, having 2-year licenses on software for people that don't work there anymore. Have deferred liability on salaries and severances. And just, it's incredible how you use the corporate credit card to buy a few extra things of this and an extra of that. And every 90 days, there's swell. There's things that end up on the P&L that you're like, we don't really use that. We really don't need it. Every 90 days, everything's zeroed out and you argue it back in. And what it's done is it compresses the bad spending, which naturally creeps into the business. So I thought I'd share with everybody. These are 4 principles. It's taken me a long time. And my principles will continue to grow over time, but these are things of why it's called Moore's Law. So this is why when Sales for Life took 2012 is when we started. I think we got to $3 million by 2016. So that's a 4-year. And the next business, Pipeline Signals, was able to get from 0 to like $1 million in half the time it took to get Sales for Life. And the goal here with Get Leverage is, again, getting to 7-figure and then ideally 8-figure in half the time it would have taken those other businesses. Why? Because you're taking your learnings and you're applying them instantly to compress the mistakes, because it's ultimately the mistakes that slow you down. So anyways, I want to keep sharing some of these entrepreneurial best practices alongside all the other things that I share. So I hope you found this valuable. Thanks.